Welcome, everyone. We have Dr. Sanchez joining us today from University of South Florida. She is the Chief of Audiology and the head of the Auditory Rehabilitation and Clinical Trials Laboratory there, and she will be giving us a talk about the ACHIEVE study. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for this opportunity. It is quite the honor. I often watch your guys' YouTubes and all the other presentations that you share. You do a great job of bringing science to everyday clinicians. And that's hopefully my goal today too, with the opportunity to talk about the ACHIEVE trial. First slide here, of course, is some disclosures, but usually with disclosures, that also means that you have gratitude to share. So we've had lots of opportunities to conduct really great research from out of the University of South Florida with my closest collaborators, Dr. Terry Chisholm. Slides are jumping without me. My closest collaborators, Drs. Terry Chisholm, Haley Calloway, and Michelle Arnold at the University of South Florida. But the work that I'll be talking to you guys today is from groups of clinicians and researchers, team science all together. There is a QR code here that will bring you to a document that has a full list of disclosures and acknowledgements. But to save you from going through all of those today from a big group, I'll just mention that the work discussed today was supported by the National Institute of Health and through a generous support from Sonova. With that being said, I want to first jump into my first collaborative piece of work to highlight, which is focusing on auditory wellness. So this is a recent publication that was in Trends in Hearing, and it was my privilege to work with Dr. Larry Hume, Sumit Dar, Vinay Machara, Anu Sharma, and again, my two closest colleagues, Michelle Arnold and Terry Chisholm. And in this commentary piece, we highlight how auditory wellness aligns with the World Health Organization's International Classification in Functioning and Disability Health Framework, or the WHO ICF. And what we're really trying to say here is that we're defining auditory wellness as the processing of sound that enables the individual to fully participate in a wide range of daily listening activities without limitations or restrictions. Now, I'm assuming the audience today is very familiar with an audiogram. So we're not talking about an audiogram. We're not talking about pure tone hearing loss. We're talking because that tells us very little about someone's functional hearing ability and how their hearing allows them to engage in the world around them. Instead, we're really talking about how, if we think about the World Health Organization ICF model, how that hearing impairment interacts with other diseases and comorbidities, how it affects someone's activity limitation and their participation in restrictions, and how that really leads to someone's wellness and well-being. So again, to definitively kind of give a definition for what I mean by auditory wellness, we're going to call it the effective processing of sound that enables the individual to fully participate in a wide range of daily listening activities without limitations or restrictions. Now, to tell you a little bit more what that definition means, if you look first on the left-hand figure, I think it's showing up on your side, auditory wellness. Now, it's not just being able to hear sensitivity, pure tones and so forth, but it also is the processing of speech sounds, the localization of sound in space, and the processing of complex sounds and non-speech sounds. All of that together to really tell us how well we are engaging with the soundscapes around us. And with that being said, hearing loss is so much more than just an auditory issue. It is deeply entwined with our physical, psychological, social, and emotional wellness. Here on the other side of the figure, you see how auditory wellness, represented with the gray circles here, can interact directly with our other aspects of wellness and ultimately our overall well-being. So although the general concept of holistic hearing health or overall health is not necessarily new to most clinicians, audiologists, otologists, etc., I'm sure every day you see in your clinics how good hearing can lead to positive health outcomes. It was really critical for our team to provide a formal definition of auditory wellness as the effective processing of sound that empowers the individuals to fully participate in the activities that they want to participate. And then therefore would be able to strategically determine how the management of auditory wellness can then can directly influence or indirectly influence well-being. So you kind of have to define something before you can study it well, and then studying it well to determine how it affects other outcomes. So now I really want to bring these concepts of auditory wellness, other wellness, and well-being to life through the ACHIEVE study. So I think we're all good on the concepts. I've kind of hammered them down now. We're not just talking about hearing, we're talking about auditory wellness. And what did that mean for the ACHIEVE study? Now, the ACHIEVE study has gotten quite a bit of attention over the years, and maybe you've been able to see other presentations or have come across some of the publications, but I'll give a quick overview of the study and then walk you through the design, really focusing on the hearing intervention and the hearing elements that were included in the ACHIEVE study. But the ACHIEVE study is only happened because of 7 institutions and many investigators and researchers with lots of different expertise and talents. And importantly, the ACHIEVE study was directly embedded in the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities Neurocognitive Study, or it's referred to as the ARIC study. Now, the ARIC study is a long-standing study for over 35 years of following over 1,600 adults at 4 U.S. cities and really following their health. And conveniently, when we were starting the ACHIEVE study, a good portion of the ARIC participants were in the age group that we were looking to recruit from with untreated hearing loss as well. And I'll tell you more about the ARIC study within ACHIEVE in just a minute. But let me first just show you a timeline. This timeline really here, it illustrates the progression of the ACHIEVE trial from its early planning stage to present day. And I think it really underscores the depth of commitment and the long-standing collaboration that has been made this research possible. You see here our primary PI for ACHIEVE, Frank Lin, along with Joseph Caress, really started the ACHIEVE trial. Since then, Dr. Lin has moved on to work on larger impact of hearing care with Apple, and now Jennifer Deal and Joseph Caress and myself lead most of the ACHIEVE current trials. With that being said, today's presentation is really going to focus on the main ACHIEVE trial, which was from 2018 to 2022, 2023. So although there was pre-work and there's still work being done today, most of what I'll be sharing wise, data-wise, things that are analyzed and published so far comes out of this time frame here. Now, the ACHIEVE trial design is shown here. It is a long-term follow-ups trial looking at the effect of hearing intervention over 3 years. We randomized participants, almost 1,000 individuals, to either receive a hearing intervention or a healthy control intervention. I'll give details of those in just a minute. And then the primary outcome was to look at cognitive decline after 3 years of hearing care. Now, again, I mentioned that the ACHIEVE study was directly embedded into the ARIC study. And from the ARIC study, we were able to recruit 238 individuals. And these were individuals who met our inclusion criteria, who have also been followed for many years. In addition to this 238 directly from the ARIC study, we also recruited another 739 individuals, which we refer to as de novo, or from the communities surrounding our field sites. Now, these participants received active recruitment methodology, meaning that they were responding to come in and be a part of a research study. They were interested in being in a study that looked at healthy aging, and most of them were also interested in receiving hearing care as part of being in the study. So with that being said, as we think about the primary focus of the ACHIEVE study, we are powered to detect a change in cognition, which was our primary outcome. And we were also going to be able to collect a lot of other health outcomes to see how hearing intervention affected those. For today's presentation, I'm going to switch these other areas of interest to really talk about how within the ACHIEVE study, what is the effect of 3 years of hearing intervention on auditory wellness, concepts of wellness, and overall well-being. So with kind of marching you through the ACHIEVE study as a whole, let's look at a flow diagram. I mentioned around 2018 is when we first started recruiting participants. We did find 977 individuals who met our criteria that were ready to be randomized, either into the hearing intervention or the successful aging control intervention. From the breakout of these recruitment efforts, you can see here that across our 4 field sites of Minnesota, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Maryland, we had around 230-ish across each site, so pretty evenly distributed. And again, I mentioned that majority of our participants, 739, were from those local communities, while 238 were directly recruited from our ERIC cohort study. Now, I keep bringing ERIC versus de novo up because it will be a concept that we'll talk through a lot when we get into the results. But it's really critical to know that these 2 recruitment sources are very different types of patient populations. The ERIC cohort is more of a natural represented cohort. They're people that you would run into on a daily basis. They weren't necessarily the people that were seeking help or coming into an audiological clinic. So in general, the ERIC cohort were a little bit older. They differed on specific demographics. There were more Black, less education, less income, and more health comorbidities. So these were the individuals that had more reports of diabetes, hypertension, other cardiovascular issues. And although their cognition was normal at recruitment and baseline, it was more on the lower level of normal. So it was more borderline. Versus our de novo community cohort, these individuals were a little bit younger, and sometimes we like to describe them as the well warriors. These are people who are actively engaging in their health and in research to potentially improve their health as well. So if I go back to my flow diagram, across all the people that we recruited, about 1,000 individuals, half were randomized to the hearing intervention and half were randomized to the successful control education. Now, each intervention had 4 intervention sessions with a professional. So there was the same amount of time, regardless of what intervention you received, with a health professional, either an audiologist or health education professional. Every individual across the 3 years also received semi-annual and annual intervention booster sessions, meaning they came in and they've gotten care specifically for their randomized intervention they received. And they also received semi-annual and annual outcome measures across 3 years. Everyone received the same amount of time in the clinic as part of the research study, in other words. The interventions were definitely different. Let me tell you a little bit more about them. The successful aging intervention is based on the 10 keys of healthy aging. This is a evidence-based education program that really focuses on teaching older individuals about health risk. It is personalized where the individuals get to choose which health risks that they would like to learn more about. They create goals. They had exercise and stretching programs. And all of this program was developed, has been previously shown to be efficacious, and was implemented in the ACHIEVE study led by researchers out of the University of Pittsburgh, which was led by Dr. Nancy Glenn. Now, the hearing intervention was designed and supported by our group at the University of South Florida. And to tell you more about the hearing intervention, I like to start off with this. Hearing intervention is not a one-size-fits-all. And these bikes really help represent that. For those of you who are in clinic who might be dealing with people with hearing loss and providing hearing interventions, hearing aids, cochlear implants, everything under the sun, you know you just can't hand someone a box and say, here's your hearing aid, go forth. Really, hearing intervention really needs to be personalized and tailored to that specific person. Or you'll have scenarios like this, where a bike might be too big for someone, too small for someone else, or not be usable at all. well. And that's the same thing with hearing intervention. We need technological components and support components that are very specific to our patient needs. So the bikes can fit, or in other words, so the hearing intervention can have its most success. So I'd like to tell you more about the components of the Achieve Hearing Intervention, and also tell you a little bit about the participants that were in the Achieve Hearing Intervention cohort. And so I'm kind of going to do both. I'm going to tell you about the intervention, the measures we actually used to collect data on them, and what our participants actually looked like. So in a publication that we were able to get out in 2024, we really thoroughly describe the audiological baseline characteristics of the Achieve participants. And I really highlight that to any of our clinicians in the room, because sometimes you receive research and you think, are these patients like the patients that I see in my clinic? So you could refer to these slides or refer to this publication and really think if what we describe of our Achieve participants, are these similar to the patients that you see in your clinic as well. So with that being said, the participants in the Achieve study, as they went through the comprehensive hearing evaluation, they had what was referred to as more of a moderate hearing loss, with their better ear 4-frequency PTA in that range of about 35 to 50 decibels. We had a few people with more milder losses and additional individuals with slightly higher than that. These were individuals that majority of them had difficulty with speech and noise, which was measured with a Quickson test. Our Quickson was administered in a sound-filled environment with speech that was presented at 0 degrees azimuth and the noise presented behind the listener. For the most part, participants had about a 6 dB SNR loss, which indicates a more mild to moderate difficulty hearing and background noise. With regards to the participants' self-reported hearing abilities, using the hearing handicap in a single question on trouble with hearing, more than 50% indicated more mild to moderate hearing handicap, and 77 indicated at least a little bit of trouble hearing. So these were individuals who noticed, for the most part, that they did have hearing problems, and their audiological test results showed the same. Now, the next component of the Achieve Hearing Intervention is really what I refer to as the most important component of the Achieve Hearing Intervention. It is what we refer to as the individualized goal setting, education, counseling, and management. Now, individualized goal setting, the purpose of this was to target participants' specific communication needs and foster realistic expectations. We did this through the client-oriented scale of improvement, or the COSI. COSI is very commonly used in most audiology clinics for the purposes of coming up with measurable, person-centered goals for hearing intervention. Now, these goals were specific and prioritized by all of our individuals. What I show here is the number of different goals based on different categories. So of our about 500 participants in the Achieve study, majority of them had a goal that was about listening, having a conversation in noise, in quiet, listening on the television, and etc. And we'll talk more about these goals in just a little bit. But the creation of these goals then allowed us to move on to the next component of the Achieve intervention, which was selecting and providing the technological solution to manage the hearing loss. So this included both hearing aids and hearing assistive technology. By using the COSI goals, the audiological findings and configuration, and the Quickson score, we were able to then provide participants with either hearing aids that were considered basic, intermediate, or advanced technology. So in audiological practice, you have a series of different technology levels that vary in feature set, and we decided to, using an evidence-based protocol, match the technology level based on the participants' needs, goals, and hearing loss. All participants were provided at no cost to them Phonak Odeo hearing aids, either at the 50, 70, or 90 levels. Now, these devices weren't just handed to the participants and wish them good luck. Of course, we provided verification and validation. Every time the hearing aid was in a field site clinic, electroacoustic analysis was performed on the hearing aid to ensure that it was functioning at its best capacity. Any type of manipulation to the hearing aid or to the patient's needs was made. On-ear device verification using real ear measures were always completed. So this was tip-top best practice audiology to make sure that these hearing aids were functioning and providing the best audibility possible. In addition to hearing aids, because most often than not, hearing aids are not enough to meet everyone's listening goals. We also required participants to utilize at least one hearing assistive technology to help meet their listening goals. And so these technologies ranged from remote microphones, TV links, and even FM systems to help with the most challenging listening scenarios. The last component of the Achieve hearing intervention was the outcome assessments, because you really need to validate hearing intervention in short term and to hopefully make sure that those good outcomes maintain across the course of usage. So in the Achieve study, we had outcome assessment that happened during that intervention phase, which included looking at data logging, are the hearing aids being worn? We were doing cozy goal assessments. We used the International Outcome Inventory, or the IOIHI, and we also did aided speech and noise assessment. So these were ways for us to ensure that the intervention we were providing was meeting our patients' needs, providing us the outcomes that we want, and then continuing to make sure that was the case across the 3 years of the study. But I go back to the point of making sure that the hearing intervention was personalized and patient-centered, making sure that those bikes fit all of our participants. And so we really did that in the Achieve study through our education, counseling, and self-management materials. So although people got very similar devices, how they were supported to use those devices in their personal listening scenarios were really supported by our education and self-management materials. And that was through our toolkit for self-management. So this was actually materials specifically developed for the Achieve study. These materials help teach adult hearing aid users about their hearing loss and customized to the specific goals. So if people had goals that were about listening and communication and noise, there were materials specifically for that, as well as communication strategies, listening on the telephone and with television, meetings and crowds, places of worship, hearing assistive technology. Critical to the Achieve study is that all of these materials were written in an infographic way with a variety that could be read by a variety of health literacy backgrounds and incorporated both inclusive and racially diverse images, which was really important since we had 4 sites across the United States, and these materials needed to be received and appreciated by all participants in the Achieve study. In addition to the written materials, we also had media materials as well. We used the C2 Hear Reusable Learning Objectives, or RLOs, and these are short 2 to 7 video clips that cover a common variety of different topics for new hearing aid users, and patients were encouraged to watch these videos in office with the audiologist and also had access to them for any re-references as well. Now, if we go back to the flow diagram, after the individuals received their 4 intervention sessions, they then were seen every 6 months for the next 3 years. This is when we get to our outcome measures. So at the end of 3 years, we are now able to look at the effect of hearing intervention versus a control healthy aging intervention. Before I jump into the differences between the 2 groups, I want to highlight the evidence of achieving auditory wellness. So in the Achieve study, did we achieve auditory wellness? And I will be super annoying and say achieve and achieving over and over and over again. It is our study. We are the Achieve study, and I feel like we're forever achieving. So with that, I'd like to then move on to the evidence of achieving auditory wellness in the Achieve study, highlighting these aspects of auditory wellness down here. Starting off with self-reported hearing hours of use. So across the 3-year time frame, majority of our participants really used their hearing aids. They wore them on average 10 to 8 to 7 hours across those 3-year time points. So in regards to does a hearing intervention work, one of the first things that we want to see is if they actually use the hearing aids, and a good portion of our participants absolutely did. In addition to that, if while wearing their hearing aids, could they achieve better speech and noise performance ability? And what I show you here on this figure, the darker green shows you the unaided quicksand versus the lighter green shows you the aided quicksand. Now, the lower signal to noise ratio means that they could hear better in the background noise. So across the 3 years, we saw a definite improvement in someone's ability to understand speech and background noise. It is interesting to see, though, that overall across 3 years, majority of participants got a little worse with their speech and noise ability, meaning that their unaided performance went from 7 dBSNR to 10 by year 3, but the improvement they still received from the hearing aids is definitely noticeable. Moving on to cozy goal attainment. So we had those personalized goals, and this is some work that just came out this month in AJA, where we really talked about were we able to meet these cozy goals, and was there any influence on hearing technology level with respect to meeting those goals? So what I show you in this bar graph here is the different categories of goals that our chief participants had, and if they received a standard, advanced, or premium technology. So there were a variety of goals by our participants. And did we meet those goals with respect to the technology that was provided? So in these two figures, they're a little bit smaller, but the first one on the left here shows the rate, has the participants rate the degree of change in hearing in ability in the situation. So in the situation and the goals that were important to them, were they doing worse? Were they no different? Or were they slightly better or much better? Separated by technology level with the different colors from gray to dark blue. And you can see here on this left-hand side, almost everyone said that they, with their hearing technology, regardless of technology level, they could hear much better. Same thing with the second question of the cozy, which is to rate your ability to hear now in this situation, regardless of technology level of hearing aids that they received. Almost everyone could hear most of the time with these. So if we collapse that across the technology level, again, the same story is there, regardless of hearing aid technology received. Everyone reported, majority of people reported that they were able to achieve their cozy goals and their listening scenarios that were important to them. Now, a couple more self-reported questionnaires to kind of see if we achieved good auditory wellness. This question here was, has your hearing aid changed your enjoyment of life? With most individuals indicating a lot better or much better. This question here says, do you think a hearing aid is worth the trouble? With majority of individuals indicating very much worth the trouble. This question here says, think about the situation where you most wanted to hear better. When you use your present hearing intervention, how much difficulty do you still have in that situation? So this really gets at limitations and restrictions. And with the hearing intervention, our chief participants said that they have slight difficulty to no difficulty once they receive their hearing intervention. The last outcome regarding auditory wellness that I will highlight comes from the Hearing Handicap Inventory, or the HHIE. Now, the HHIE is one of the most commonly used self-reported outcome measures to look at hearing handicap, and it was recently recommended by the NASM report as a core outcome measure to really try to look at improvements with hearing intervention. What I'll show you here to start with is going to be a waterfall plot. So what we're going to see here is the circles are going to represent individual participants in the ACHIEVE study. The red will represent individuals who have received the hearing intervention. The first two examples on this figure show two participants at baseline where they had a severe hearing handicap at first, and they were able to drop that hearing handicap across 3 years down to no handicap. So either severe or mild in those two dots. This next figure will really show you what I mean by that. But these are just two individuals. They started off with a very bad handicap. They were able to improve their auditory wellness. Now this is the figure that represents almost all 1,000 individuals that were in our study. So again, the red indicates those that received the hearing intervention, and you can see that we have majority of people that had quite a bit of trouble with their hearing, causing great handicap, with most of those lines going down, meaning that they got better hearing with the hearing intervention, versus the blue is the comparison of the control, successful aging education control, who didn't receive a hearing intervention. Most of their arrows went up across the 3 years, which would make sense. They didn't receive any intervention to support their hearing handicap. Here, I'll put a line across here of the figure, because that line really represents no hearing handicap versus not. And you can see that a good portion of our participants in the Achieve study started with a significant hearing handicap and were able to get down to none, potentially really representing that they were able to achieve good auditory wellness. Now, this is an individual look. If we look at our mean data across our groups, this figure here really highlights that the control and intervention were the same at baseline. You can see the blue and the red were right there together, with everyone in the Achieve study essentially having more of a mild to moderate hearing handicap at start. As soon as 6 months happen, you can see that red line takes a dramatic drop. We have an improvement in hearing handicap, and that result maintained across the full 3 years. Versus the control intervention, as in this group, you can see it was pretty steady. They didn't receive any hearing healthcare, therefore it's not necessarily surprising they stayed the same and slightly got worse over time. So the last few slides were the evidence that I would like to show of improved auditory wellness. And now I'd like to move on from that. And if we can all agree that there is some improved auditory wellness, how does that necessarily then influence our other aspects of wellness and well-being? And with that, we wanted to map some of our measurements and assessments in the Achieve study to these specific areas of wellness. So we had measurements that looked at psychological wellness, emotional wellness, social wellness, and physical wellness. What I show you here are the specific tests that I will just describe in just a few minutes. But ultimately, what we're really going to do is, if we improve auditory wellness, how does that influence cognition, fatigue, social engagements, and falls? So that's what I'm going to walk you through on the second half of the talk now. So starting off with cognitive health. This is the primary outcome of the Achieve study. It's the results that were reported in the Lancet manuscript in 2023. And it was the whole purpose of the Achieve study. Now, the cognitive assessment that was done in the Achieve study comes from a standardized comprehensive neurocognitive battery. It is 10 tests that make up this entire comprehensive assessment. The tests are shown here. Majority of the tests don't have any listening or verbal component to them, but there are a few that do. And if we look across the tests, we can map those tests to different areas of cognitive domains as well. So memory domain, executive function domain, and language domain. The primary outcome of Achieve was to look at the global factor score, so across all 10 tests and across all 3 domains of cognition, a single factor score that's developed there, then looking at these scores with regards to standardization to baseline. So we can look at change in cognition performance relative to baseline. Here are our results. So what you see here on this figure is red is the hearing intervention, blue is the control, hearing cognition performance relative to baseline at time point 0 to 3 years. Yes, that red and blue line are right on top of each other. Essentially, there is no difference between interventions on cognition in the total cohort. So of 1,000 participants, we did not see any effect of hearing intervention on cognition across 3 years. And now, if you haven't seen these results, you're probably going, well, this is a bummer. You've been talking for me for so long and you're going to end with that. Well, the story doesn't quite end there. Let me show you this. This is a forest plot, and we're going to be looking at a couple different forest plots. So let me walk you through how you can look at these forest plots. So the forest plots have a line of no effect, which lands right there on 0. And then performance will either favor the intervention or favor the control. And you can see here for our primary outcome across all of our participants, there's essentially no difference between the interventions that were received. Now, we did know that we had 2 different recruitment sources into the CHIEF study. So we had a pre-specified analysis that we wanted to look at, looking at those 2 different patient populations, which was the ERIC versus the de novo population. And when we look at that, when we look at the almost 238 individuals from the ERIC sub-study, we can see a very significant positive effect of hearing intervention on cognition change over 3 years. And in fact, that change is reflective of about a 48% reduction in cognitive decline in this patient population. If we look at the change in cognition over this 3 years in this figure here, we can kind of better understand the story. So first, I'd like you to look at the de novo group, okay? You can see the de novo group, which were our healthy volunteers that wanted to participate in our study. We can almost see no change in their cognition over 3 years. You can't necessarily stop something from changing if it's not changing. So that's kind of where we're thinking why we didn't see much of an effect of hearing intervention, is that there wasn't much change to have an effect, especially in the de novo group. But when we look in the ERIC cohort, they started off with poorer cognition at baseline. So their red and blue is a little bit lower at time point 0. And we can see across 3 years that we really start to see the difference, where the hearing intervention is definitely shows a slowing of that reduction in cognition. And this was statistically significant. Now, to further explore the hypothesis that participants with multiple risk factors for cognitive decline, poorer health, are more likely to receive greater benefit from hearing intervention, we did a secondary analysis looking at the estimated amount of risk someone might have based on their health and comorbidities. And so this is results that came out just in 2025 in Alzheimer's and dementia. What we did is we looked at the, depending on someone's risk factors, we indicated if they had low risk versus high risk. And we categorized all 1,000 individuals into high risk, not just the ERIC individuals, but anyone who was considered a high risk individual. We actually saw that hearing intervention slowed cognitive decline by 62% in that cohort, in that group. So with all that being said, the evidence that I've showed you today starts to demonstrate that we could possibly reduce cognitive decline with good auditory wellness in at least some participants. But then the next question is, what about these other elements of wellness? And the next one I'd like to walk you through is fatigue. And for fatigue, this is going to be a nice proxy of emotional wellness. So in a secondary analysis of the ACHIEVE study that was led by Dr. Sarah Besson, we looked at fatigue using 2 self-reported validated instruments, the PROMIS fatigue scale and the RAND short form health survey SF36 fatigue subscale. What you can see here are the questions that the ACHIEVE participants had to answer with regards to fatigue. And on this slide, I show you the forest plot. And what we can see here is that on 2 elements of fatigue, majority of responses indicate that the hearing intervention reduced fatigue. And I will say over a 3-year time frame, majority of participants in the ACHIEVE had an increase in fatigue reporting, but those that received the hearing intervention had less fatigue than the control intervention. So with improved auditory wellness, we potentially see some evidence of decreased fatigue and support of emotional wellness. How about social engagement? Social engagement, social wellness. We published these results led by Dr. Nick Reed in 2025, and we looked at both concepts of social engagement with regards to loneliness and social networks. So let me start with loneliness, because loneliness is someone's perceived perception of their social engagement. So you can have people who have one friend and they are not lonely. You can have people who have 50 friends and they report themselves as being very lonely. So loneliness is an internal report of someone's in social engagement. So with regards to loneliness, the way that we look at this figure, the y-axis would indicate more loneliness going up. So at baseline, all participants reported about a 33-degree of loneliness. And we can see that the control intervention got a little bit more lonely across 3 years versus the hearing intervention had a nice decline in loneliness starting at 6 months, which relatively maintained across the 3-year time point. So we were able with hearing intervention to reduce loneliness. Now, the other aspect of social engagement is how many people are you socially engaged with? So this is not necessarily someone's self-perception, but these are raw numbers of how many people do you regularly interact with. So these two figures, now the y-axis is different. We're going up on the figures means more socially engaged, larger network size and larger social diversity, how many different people you interact with. And what we can see in these two figures, they show a similar story. At baseline, all participants were relatively around the same. The hearing intervention group actually increased their social network size, the diversity of that size, and that maintained across the 3 years versus the control group seemed to be losing social engagement over time. Again, if we want to look at that in our forest plot, we can see here that hearing intervention favored social engagements with respect to both loneliness and network and embeddedness. So with that being said, hearing auditory wellness really increased social engagement and decreased loneliness. And that brings us to our last aspect of wellness that I'd like to highlight, which is physical wellness with regards to falls. Now, this is work that we recently published in Lancet Public Health, and the concept of hearing in falls is not relatively new. There's a good amount of research that's been looking at associations that those with hearing loss have an increased risk of falls, but what we wanted to ask is if we did something about the hearing loss with hearing intervention, does it reduce the falls? So our falls outcomes were self-reported reports of fall occurrence. Did the person have a fall? How many times did they fall? And was that fall an injurious fall resulted in hospitalization? Participants had to answer these questions every 6 months as part of that 3-year time period. Overall, what we can see here in our forest plot is that hearing intervention reduced the total number of falls, both non-injurious and injurious falls. And we think about that across the 3-year time period. What we recently reported is that the hearing intervention corresponds to about a 27% reduction in the mean number of falls compared to the control group. So something as simple as improving someone's auditory wellness could have a very significant influence on their fall risk and the amount of falls that they have. So stepping back, this is everything that I've described so far is the achieved data that tells us a little bit about auditory wellness and then potentially how we can map auditory wellness to this well-being model. So treating hearing loss didn't just improve auditory outcomes, it also had measurable positive effects across multiple domains of wellness. Here's just another way to visualize what hearing intervention achieved over 3 years in the ACHIEVE trial. So working from the bottom and going all the way up, we saw improved auditory wellness with improved communication, reduced fatigue, reduced falls, reduced social isolation and loneliness, and in at least individuals with more risk, reduced cognitive decline. Now, every one of these findings so far that we've talked to have been published, and these papers and access to this information is available on our Achieve website. But to be balanced, I also want to mention that we also didn't get to highlight today. There were plenty of outcomes that we evaluated and achieved that did not show any effect of hearing intervention. We didn't see any effect of hearing intervention on physical functioning using actigraph and accelerometry, physical activity, self-reported depression, or a generic health-related quality of life. So I always like to be balanced and make sure we say that, because Achieve has been giving us a plethora of data that really shows positive findings, and that is true, but it's not a panacea. I joke and say, my next slide will show you how hearing intervention cures cancer. Of course not. My point is that although we can see lots of positive good things with improved auditory wellness, improved hearing ability, it's just one aspect of someone's ability to fully engage both physically and mentally with the worlds around them. But really we'll need to have improvements in vision and health and diet. And you can only imagine, if we were really trying to treat the person as a whole, that if we could treat hearing intervention and everything else, we probably will see even greater effects of good aspects of health on overall well-being. This will be my last slide and just a few take-home messages. I hope today that I did an okay job of describing the evidence of achieving auditory wellness in the Achieve study for overall well-being. With that being said, it is pretty commonly accepted that we acknowledge that there are negative health consequences related to untreated hearing loss. People who have poor auditory wellness have poor health outcomes. Now, auditory wellness impacts the processing of speech, complex sound, sound and space. All of those are elements of auditory wellness that allows an individual to fully participate in a wide range of desired listening activities without limitations and restrictions. Through the Achieve studies and many other great research that's also going out, there's growing evidence that improving auditory wellness with hearing interventions leads to improved health outcomes. And I would say that auditory wellness is critical to physical, emotional, cognitive, and social wellness and overall well-being. One last statement that I'd like to make, because I think there's a group of clinicians on the meeting today. As we consider the influence of hearing intervention on a wide range of health outcomes, I really would like to encourage that the hearing interventions are evidence-based, patient-centered, a holistic approach, really best practice hearing intervention, because to me, the quality of the hearing intervention, the support and the self-management that's required to achieve good auditory wellness, these are the interventions I think are likely to improve auditory wellness and have an overall improvement on someone's well-being. With that said, I mentioned that this was a huge team effort across our 7 institutions supporting the Achieve study, lots and lots of people. And I promise to bring that QR code back up, which will lead to references, full disclosures, and so forth. But I will pause there.